In what ways has your opinion on things changed this week? For me, as I was preparing for this sermon, my mind was actually driven to a change. This change revolves around my thoughts on this kind of ideal woman who is a wife. You see, actually, when I do biblical counseling, I will frequently ask couples, when I counsel couples together, to name the ideal married couple that they've known, right? The perfect husband and the perfect wife as far as they've known them, right? And if I would answer this myself, my mind has always tended to go fairly early in my Christian walk, and I've thought of this godly couple that was in my church in high school. And I think for the wife, I certainly would list her as one of these kind of ideal wives. But perhaps from the text that we're going to study today, my mind has drifted a little bit now. Now I think of somebody else. See, there was a woman in that same church that I went to in high school, and let's call her T, because I actually don't fully remember her name. And T was a godly woman. I was in the youth group, and T would serve very frequently. And when T would serve in the youth group, as well as come to church, she would always come by herself. But I knew she was married, in part because T was a woman who, especially to the youth, talked very positively about her husband. And it sounded like T's husband, maybe he had some limitations, but he seemed like just must be like a godly man with how she talks about him. But all things kind of seemed off with T. So T was so sweet and so dedicated to her Lord, but there would be times where perhaps she would be supposed to be helping with the youth, and she wouldn't make it. She would always come on Sundays, but there would be times where kind of things were just a little bit different. And I knew that T was in a position where she didn't really have to work much financially through her household needs. She lovely home, but she would often work extra hours. And later in my life, when I was graduating high school and heading off to college, I learned that T was a person who was married to a man who not only was a non-believer, but was pretty rough and cruel at times. And T's husband kind of mocked her faith. T's husband asked T to not gather with the saints, but she chose to do so nonetheless, to honor her God. T's husband made choices that weren't always wise, and this resulted in T having to work some, particularly so that she could use her resources to support the work of the ministry and support others that she saw in need. But through it all, T put her hope in Jesus, and T sought to be a godly wife. For T, whether or not she was a godly wife was not dependent upon whether or not she had a godly husband. And I think T saw something that we really see in the book of 1 Peter today. And we're going to learn about that kind of attitude as we dive into 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 6 today. I want to remind you, we've been working through 1 Peter for a while now, and last week in 1 Peter we learned about submitting and hardships. And today we're going to learn two principles related specifically to a godly wife and a godly woman really as well in 1 Peter. First, we're going to learn a godly wife has power, and secondly, we'll learn a godly woman is adorned. So let's go ahead and read our text. I'll be reading from the ESV today. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good. You do not fear anything that is frightening. Sends the reading of God's holy, inerrant, inspired word. As Scripture says in Isaiah, the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Let's pray. Father God, I pray that you guide the study of your word, even as it's been doing unusually, as we're reminded of what we learned on Sunday, but we're recording in a separate time in my office. And I pray this would be encouragement to somebody today. And I ask that you would help people to live in light of the work of Jesus, I pray that you would help women to be godly wives, and I pray that you would help men to learn from the example of godly women as well. And I ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Our first principle today is a godly wife has power. Peter has been teaching Christians in roles that involve submission, how to live out the Christian faith. Peter now moves to address the submission of godly wives. Peter gives more of his letter to instructions about being a godly wife than he does to any other Christian role, any role that involves submission, that is. This extensive teaching on wives shows us that, as we know from historians, the early church was disproportionately female. Such women understanding their family role, that was key to godly alien living. Peter commands Christian wives to submit to their own husbands. We'll teach about the submission a wife gives her husband, but Peter's clarification is important. In the Roman world, women were seen as lesser beings who should show deference to all men of all kinds. But Christian women are equal in value to any man at all. The only man a Christian woman is asked to submit to, beyond what God asks of her, a man that would be in a similar place to her, is she's asked to submit to her husband if and when a Christian woman is married. Anything else beyond that, I'm going to be frank, it is unbiblical, and it is a dangerous idea to ask anything beyond that. Peter's actual commands to wives is brief. Christian wives submit to their husbands. This submission, like other Christian submission, includes showing honor. This includes a willingness to follow. This includes a respectful attitude. Peter showed us that submission is always for the purpose of honoring God more than the person. Paul gives the same command Peter gives us in Ephesians 5:22. But Paul provides purpose with it. And Paul limits that submission. Paul writes, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." A Christian wife's first purpose is honoring and obeying God. That's the chief purpose of her. This is true whether she's married or not. A Christian's first purpose is honoring and obeying God. Christian wives worship God when they submit, though. They should never submit to anything, then, that they could argue biblically is sinful. That means they shouldn't submit to sin against them, or they shouldn't submit to participating in sin. Peter adds additional alien purpose to this call for a wife's submission. Some of the first Christian women were married to lost Roman men. Basically, such women loved Jesus and their husbands. That's their role. And because they love their husbands and they love Jesus, they naturally want to see their husbands saved. Peter tells these women that their submission to undeserving men that don't deserve their submission, that submission might play a pivotal role in husbands coming to the Lord. If such Christian women submitted and lived kind, godly lives, Peter tells us those husbands may be won without a word. Now, I want to be clear. Romans 10:17 shows us that faith comes exclusively by hearing. These women had clearly shared the content of their faith. One day, those words, though, might come to mind when lost husbands struggle to understand why their wife, with a different God, is such a unique and powerful blessing. A wife's evangelism, you see, is buttressed by the entirety of her Christian character. Spiritually dead men with Christian brides should be able to see their wives living out respectful and pure conduct. A Christian woman should want to respect those God placed in authority over her. And she should want to live a morally pure life. But she should chiefly want this because that honors her God. It's really not primarily about her husband. It's about her God. A secondary reason to live in such a way is for evangelistic purposes. Lost people, including spouses, are suspicious of Christians. This is just truth. When Christians show unparalleled respect, when they show consistent character, what happens is sometimes prejudices are disproven. And so we see an application today. Kingdom living embraces domestic submission. We've talked about living as aliens for Jesus in this study of 1 Peter. The Bible sees the alien life in the ordinary. It sees it in the domestic, not just in things like being a missionary, but in things like being a spouse, a parent. When a Christian wife submits, she wages spiritual warfare. This wife shakes the foundation of this world by the Spirit's power. I don't think I'm overstating things, that I am speaking boldly, and wives that might be listening. I want to tell you seriously, when you submit, even when it's hard, what you are doing is something that is truly incredible and honoring to God. Christian women should have wonderful ministries for the Lord outside of the household. This passage is not limiting that. A married woman's nearest ministry, though, is in the household. In Titus chapter 2, verse 5, Paul wants older Christian women to teach younger Christian women, and he wants them to teach many things. But high in this list are this call to work at home. By the way, this simply and kind of vaguely means tending to the needs of a household. Right? So it's going to mean, in a way, a different thing in a world of vacuum cleaners and dishwashers than it would in the first century. And even there, it varies by household. And he also asks wives to be submissive to their own husbands. He says older women should teach younger women this. Godly wives, they can be varied. Some godly wives make more money than their husbands. Others are homemakers. Even some are homemakers with an empty nest. All of that can be godly. Some are prevented by disability from working much inside or outside of the home. But for every Christian wife, God is calling you, if you are a wife, to bless your husband. Women bless their households through particularly loving the family that God has given them. They're not called to bless their households by fitting some 1950s stereotype. This blessing of a household is an essential ministry of a godly married woman. So if you're listening to this as a married woman, I want you to ask yourself, how can you love your husband? As in your husband specifically. This is a question you need to answer for yourself. Part of a household ministry for a married woman will be submitting. Godliness for a wife involves following a husband's leadership. It involves obeying him, unless doing so would be participating in sin. I want to give some important caveats here. First, nowhere in the Bible are husbands instructed to tell their wives to submit. Nor is a lack of submission ever an excuse for a husband's sin against his wife. Further, submission does not require receiving or covering up any abuse. Finally, wives first submit to what they believe the Bible tells them. I've respected godly women who chose to disobey the leaderships of their husband on multiple religious matters, including church attendance. This was driven by following the Bible first. And I want to tell you, this is absolutely godly. In most household decisions, though, Christian wives should present their thoughts gently, and they should then submit, even if a husband makes a decision that you would not make. Wives should show trust in their husbands, but really, wives should show trust in their God enough to do this. This allows husbands to lead the family according to his conscience. Even when a husband is selfish, godly wives submit. They know that they are worshiping God. And God, he knows all. Further, missional Christians live well when mismatched, and this applies to people beyond Christian wives. A Christian wife submitting to a godly husband is beautiful. Sometimes this kind of submission liberates a woman. Such is not always the case, though. Sometimes Christian women end up married to lost men, or guys who aren't spiritually mature. Such women should never excuse ungodly behavior in the home. A spiritually mismatched woman should see their situation as a great commission opportunity. Ladies, you know the worst aspect of your husband. I'm not going to ask you to write that down or anything like that. but you know it. You should be willing to kindly address those things. But you'll most influence your husband when you shock him with kindness, when you shock him with godliness. Those with adult daughters in unequally yoked situations, though, I encourage you to pray for the gospel opportunities that God has given your daughters and support them in the hard but beautiful job of being domestic evangelists. I'm going to tell you, God does use saved spouses and vice versa to save lost spouses. God uses believers in the home to save those who are unbelievers, even if that is not an ideal situation. But our next principle today is a godly woman is adorned. In verse 3, Peter looks to another aspect of a godly woman. Christian women should consider what they convey, even when they have the right intent. Peter is concerned that some women sought the wrong kind of adornment. This word translated adornment referred to decorations placed upon something. And adornment is what we hope draws attention. All women and men are concerned about adornment. Everybody cares about this. People dress in name brand clothes or buy expensive cars because they want to convey something about themselves. Most sinful adornments would inherently be external. These would be things even acquaintances would notice. Peter wants no such thing to be the focus for such Christian women. Christian women were to reject adornings of braided hair, gold jewelry, and luxurious clothes. Modern Christians with braids and gold wedding rings, I want to tell you, you can keep them on. You don't have to throw them in the bonfire. The adornings that Peter referred to were ways people put on showiness in the first century. Now, I'm going to explain that I'm not being a liberal that's denying the Bible. I'm not making this cultural when I want it to be. Actually, even the terminology in the Greek shows very obviously that this was a cultural expression. There's not things like in 1 Timothy about the call for only men to be, men, whether they're single or married, to be pastors. That's rooted in creation. We don't see anything like that. We see the opposite in the Greek. That these made someone stand out from the crowd in the first century. To show how these words are rooted in their context, actually what's interesting is Peter never restricts expensive clothing in the Greek version of this. Peter tells these women very literally, don't wear clothes. Now, he doesn't specify which clothes, but literally it would be don't wear clothes. And since we know the Bible doesn't tell us it's sinful to wear clothes, in fact, it elevates wearing clothes often. Peter was clearly then referring to specific clothes that were seen as gaudy in Peter's day. The adornment a Christian woman should put on in its place is a hidden heart transformation. Godly women should focus on changing what's harder to see. Such a posture requires faith in God to be the one who makes others notice. Godly women were to seek consistent godliness. This includes a social godliness. A woman with a godly adornment will show a different beauty. Spiritually mature beauty will be characterized not by things we put on, but by actions. These actions, they flow from God's creation desire for woman. Peter wants woman to be beautiful through being gentle, to be beautiful through having a quiet spirit. A godly woman has a calming softness. The gentleness of a godly woman is the opposite of the sinful wife that Proverbs warns against. Proverbs 27:15 tell us a continual dripping on a raining day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. A gentle woman is nothing like this. This gentle woman eases others, even when she needs to confront them. Peter further wants women to have peaceful souls. A godly woman doesn't need to freak out and distrust others. Such a woman trusts her God. What Peter writes about won't mean much to the world, though. This isn't valued in the world. But even if it doesn't lead a husband to the Lord, Peter tells us God finds such a woman precious. Even if the culture hates it, even if the husband doesn't care for it, God finds such a woman precious. Godly women delight God. A woman with this gentleness, with this quiet, godly adornment, will practice submission if this woman is married. This truth of godly women showing their godliness through submitting to their husbands, this goes back to the patriarchs. Multiple Old Testament women practiced godliness through submission. Submissive Christian wives, you stand in a strong legacy. Peter gives a surprising woman as an example of this. Peter refers to Sarah. Sarah was far from perfect, but Peter saw something in this woman to celebrate. Specifically, Peter cites when Sarah obeyed Abraham by living a sojourner life for God with him. Sarah showed her obedience to her husband as an act of worship to God by calling Abraham Lord. The time Sarah called Abraham Lord or Master was in Genesis 18:12. This is in a context where Sarah wasn't fully on board with Abraham. She showed respect and honor. When godly women obey their husbands, such women live as Sarah's daughters. Godly women live like Sarah when they do good. They live like Sarah when they reject living in fear, even of what's frightening. Godly women are defined by the courage of trusting God enough to live a good but gentle life. An application, we see a godly modesty draws attention away. American Christian discussions on modesty, they can be odd. Oftentimes the way we think about modesty isn't the modesty the Bible is talking about. I want to ask, how do you think of modesty as you're listening? Perhaps you can write that down before we talk about it. Most modesty conversation among American Christians are about what a woman shouldn't wear, lest they, quote unquote, cause men to sin. This is wrong because it suggests people can cause others to sin. That is absolutely, positively impossible. This misses the disease for the symptoms. And modesty is the sin of drawing attention to our appearance above drawing attention to Jesus and our character. Women or men who knowingly publicly wear clothes that reveal or highlight body parts associated with sexuality, those are men and women who live immodestly. Again, men and women both. Likewise, Christians who show off wealth or status in public are also embracing immodesty. Immodesty is seen in the social media page that shows off the good life. Immodesty is seen in seeking expensive apparel that's not chiefly for sturdiness. Immodesty can include how someone approaches curb appeal for their house. Let us aspire then to be modest Christian people. We don't put on modesty by trying to look modest. Putting on modesty is rejecting making ourselves the focus. Putting on modesty is living a life where Jesus is big, and we don't have to be noticed. Embracing modesty is embracing selflessness. This is why a godly woman will make sure not to tempt through her outfit. It's not about her anymore. Godly women put on modesty by not having to look impressive, but instead letting the things people notice about her be a kind and godly posture. But further, godly gentleness in men and women brings right honor. Christians live with this modest character-focused life, and they do that by gentleness and kindness to everyone we get to impact. Gentleness should be seen in Christian men and women. But Peter recognizes there is something strong, there's something wonderful in a gentle Christian woman. Every difference a woman has that is unique about that woman, that is unique about women in general, is an opportunity for godly strength. You see, gentleness, it does wonders in this world when it comes from a Christian woman. The woman who is a source of calm in a panicked world, that is a woman who glorifies God. Gentle woman can be intelligent. Gentle woman can be clear-spoken. Gentle woman can be critical thinkers. But when a woman chooses gentleness, God gets the glory. Martin Luther has said about such a woman, earth is nothing more tender than a woman's heart when it is the abode of piety. Our last point today is godly women are courageous. If we wrote 1 Peter, we might associate not being afraid with manliness. But Peter gives this call to women. Godly women find courage for hard and humble tasks. They do this by looking to God's comfort, to God's justice. A godly woman must stand up against wickedness. She must let her voice be heard. But such women trust God enough to fight good fights while still being gentle women. Gentle and intelligent, godly women, I want to ask you, do you know that your God looks at you and your God sees strength in you? If you don't know it, I want to comfort you in this. I mean it. When you are a gentle woman, when you are a smart woman that is using so much of herself to glorify God, even sometimes when that means choosing things that your husband wouldn't choose because you know that you obey God first. When you do those hard things, God sees you as strong. Stronger than what we see as strength in even men. So we've learned two principles today. We've learned a godly wife is power, and we've learned a godly woman is adorned. You know, the way that we think of a godly woman or even a godly wife is sometimes not helpful. We should break free of this association of the 1950s ideal life as the only metric of being a godly wife. Because you see, godly women and godly wives are so varied. But when they stand for the Lord and when they seek to glorify Him, something incredible happens. Let us thank God for that. I hope you've been blessed by this study in 1 Peter 3, 1-6. God bless, brothers and sisters and friends.